Hey everybody, it's Steven from Asian Boss. This video is actually sponsored by Bill and Melinda Gates, who reached out to us to promote their annual letter. The Gates annual letter offers a perspective on social issues within the world and ways in which we as a global community can make a change. And in their 2021 annual letter, Bill and Melinda reflects on the impact of COVID-19 and how we can turn the hard lessons of this pandemic into a healthier and more equal future for all. I personally read the Gates annual letter every year, so you should definitely head over to gatesletter.com and check out the letter for yourself. Now, some of you might be wondering, why should I listen to Bill Gates? He's not a virologist or infectious disease expert. Well, you're right. That's why today, in honor of the Gates annual letter, we're gonna go speak directly with a world-renowned infectious disease and vaccine expert who's dedicated over 30 years of his life to fighting deadly viruses. Just when can we expect to see the end of COVID and take these damn masks off? When will the next pandemic hit again? Let's go find out. Really good to see you again. Thank you for your time.
It's great to see you also.
Just for the benefit of our viewers, what's your credibility when it comes to infectious disease?
I'm an MD, a medical doctor, trained in internal medicine at Duke and trained in infectious diseases at Duke. For medical school, actually, I went to Yale, and at the end of my time at Duke, I was called back into the military, and so I worked with the Army for most of my career doing HIV vaccine research.
So with the U.S. military?
With the U.S. military, correct. At the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. Walter Reed is the person who established that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes. And it was such an important discovery because it allowed us to go after the mosquitoes and reduce the burden of yellow fever for people building the Panama Canal. And so Walter Reed Army Institute of Research is this Army research institute that is dedicated to developing vaccines. The US Army did a huge amount of research on malaria, on dengue, on HIV, and for a lot of the diseases that are really found in the tropics. And you can imagine, well, why is the Army doing that kind of research? Well, where do we send soldiers? We send them out into places that the average American wouldn't ever be. So we had to have expertise in those diseases.
So all in all, you've been fighting infectious diseases for how long?
1989 was when I finished my fellowship. So that's 30 years roughly.
Let's talk about COVID. I mean, did you ever imagine that we would be here in 2021 with the extent of devastation that COVID has caused on a global scale? Is that something that you ever could have foreseen?
So as an infectious disease person, as a person, actually as a history buff who really is interested in pandemics and things, I mean, we can go back in history and you just need to look at the Black Death, the bubonic plague, the cholera. And the cholera pandemic, the one that we're in right now, started in the 1960s. So it's still going on. HIV is a pandemic. It started in 1981. We actually discovered it in 1981. It was going on before that. I mean, there are a number of things that aren't as short and furious as COVID, but that have killed even more people. And so, when you take everything in perspective, there are going to be additional pandemics. They may be very different from the COVID pandemic. I mean, it could be another virus, or it could be something that we, don't even think about in the same way. But we know that there's a looming crisis in antibiotic resistance. So, these antibiotics that we get when we go to the doctor, a lot of the germs that we fight against are becoming resistant to the antibiotics. And there are even some that are resistant to most antibiotics. And, by 2050, the studies are suggesting now we could lose 10 million lives a year and $100 trillion a year to antimicrobial resistance. So we know this is coming. We have time to prepare. And the big question that everyone has is, will we be able to do it, and will vaccines be an important part of that solution?
So basically, there's just a lot of stuff that can kill us. Viruses, germs.
And, viruses are some of the most troublesome because, as with this one, we didn't see it coming. People had long talked about the ability of these coronaviruses to jump from animals to humans, and we've had previous smaller episodes, the SARS-1 outbreak in the early 2000s, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is still a problem. There's no vaccine against it.
That's MERS, right?
That's MERS, right, which actually affected Korea in 2015 very severely. But it hasn't been as widespread as COVID-19. And the reason is that it's just not as transmissible. It has a much higher mortality if you get it. But it's much less transmissible. So there will be others. And it's an important part of the research that people are doing to understand which viruses are the most likely to jump into humans from animals, and what types of viruses they are, and what types of mechanisms we would have to be able to defend against them. Could we have drugs? Would we need vaccines? Could we use this new class of agents called monoclonal antibodies? All of these things have been developed and prepared for COVID-19, and they would be an important part of any solution set in the future.
Let's talk about the monoclonal antibodies. Is that kind of like the treatment that can be applied to any other future viruses? What is it exactly?
When you think about your body responding to a germ, like a virus, your body makes infection-fighting proteins called antibodies, and also T cells, killer T cells, helper T cells, and it's the body's way of making a strong response that will eventually contain the virus. So antibodies are directed against basically any part of the virus that's kind of sticking out, or that has the right qualities that allow the immune system to say, that is something that I need to be aware of and protect the body against. But usually it's not a single antibody. When a human being sees a virus, the body's immune system makes antibodies against multiple different protein structures on the virus. And sometimes those antibodies can be captured. And what we can do is we don't have to make all of them, we just have to make one, and usually it's the one that we believe is going to be the most effective at neutralizing the virus, that is, in making it incapable of growing or binding or entering a cell. And so we call those neutralizing antibodies. And we've done them for HIV, but we can do them for COVID or other viruses as well. So we make the single infection-fighting protein antibody that is the best at binding to this virus and inactivating it. Monoclonal antibodies are interesting because a monoclonal antibody can be used as a therapy. So for instance, in COVID, a person comes in and is not feeling well and has to go to the hospital. As soon as they enter the hospital, they're given a dose of monoclonal antibody, the way President Trump was. If you have the right monoclonal antibody, then maybe it will prevent progression to being ventilated. The other way you could use a monoclonal antibody is to give it to people who've been exposed. And we do this for other diseases. And one of the other things people are thinking about is once we get this under better control, if COVID then were to come back into Korea and you'd have a little outbreak, maybe you could take the vaccine and vaccinate everybody, but at the same time give them a shot of the COVID monoclonal antibody to give them double protection. But those are the kinds of studies that would need to be done, and that would be a great use for potential monoclonal antibody preventive therapies. The problem now is that monoclonal antibodies are fairly expensive. Some of the treatments that are used in cancer are monoclonal antibodies, and they can be $10,000 a course. And that's not something you can give to 100,000 people to prevent them from having COVID. But people have been working really hard, for instance, the Gates Foundation, in trying to lower the cost of monoclonal antibody production. And it's through efforts like that that hopefully at one point in the future we will have accessible, that is low cost, highly potent monoclonal antibodies that we can use to prevent disease as well as to treat serious illness.
So at this point, where are we with COVID? Because it's still not over. I think there's talks of like fourth wave, and then before everybody can be vaccinated, cases are rising in many different parts of the world. When do you see this whole thing just going away and then we can just stop wearing masks?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a few years. Actually, in higher income countries, we'll probably be in a much better position by the end of this year. Because, for instance, in Korea, but also by projection in the United States, Japan, Western Europe, you probably will have 70 to 80% of the population vaccinated. And that's actually really important because, some of what is driving the mutation in the coronaviruses is the amount of growth, explosive growth in the number of infected people. Because the viruses require spreading, growth in a population in order to change, in order to mutate themselves. And if you stop that, you'll stop the mutation. We get enough people vaccinated, we wear masks and distance and avoid crowds. We reduce the transmission of all coronaviruses, that decreases the rate of mutation.
I think a lot of people will be disheartened to hear that just because you get a vaccine doesn't mean you can start taking your mask off and just, back to the normal, the way things were.
So taking the mask off is something that may be possible when enough people in a country are vaccinated. So, and what is that level? And you've heard people talk about herd immunity. In the beginning part, in early last year, it was herd immunity achieved through infection, which was a bad idea. And we saw that in some of the countries that didn't try to prevent
like
COVID-19,
Sweden, right?
like Sweden. Now we might be able to achieve herd protection or herd immunity using vaccination. The Pfizer vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech RNA vaccine, has been extensively used in Israel. And now there are enough people who've been vaccinated, particularly among the elderly, so that you are actually seeing an impact on hospitalization. And that's what you want to know. Is this going to decrease the demand for significant health care? Is it going to prevent people from going to the hospital, from being ventilated, from dying? My father and my mother are in their late 80s, and I want them to be vaccinated. And they're going to continue to use masks after they're vaccinated. Until we have control, we have to use a complete system of prevention. And that includes the vaccine, it includes masks, it includes distancing and avoiding crowds. It also includes the things for instance, in Korea, testing, tracking, isolating, and treating the people who are infected. Because again, we can't let any one thing go. With COVID-19, as soon as we let our guard down, and it doesn't matter whether it's in Korea, in China, or in the United States, the virus always seems to find the weakest point, and people suffer.
How did we get it so wrong from the beginning, though? Like, couldn't we have done all this last year or the year before that?
So this is the problem, that we aren't really good at predicting which of the viruses could make the jump. And it's interesting because a number of the viruses that are plaguing us today, like HIV, came from animals. So with the coronaviruses, often they start in bats. They go through we call them intermediate or secondary hosts, another animal species. So at one point we thought for COVID-19 it might be spiny anteaters, and then it made the leap from that other species into humans. For the Middle East respiratory syndrome or MERS, it starts in bats, goes to camels, and then to humans. It's difficult to predict which coronavirus is going to, for instance, for coronaviruses, is going to make the leap next. Will it be a cousin of COVID-19? So will we have COVID-21, which is 80% similar to COVID-19, the same way that SARS-1 is 80% similar to SARS-2. There was actually a US government program looking at exactly this question and transmission from animals to humans, and it was defunded in 2018.
Why was it defunded?
So, again, it's hard to know what each administration's priorities are. I guess that there was a concern that this wasn't generating useful information. But it's interesting to know that back in the early 2000s, while I was still in the military, if you looked at and this is public information, so I'm not revealing anything top secret, the national security strategy included pandemic diseases, including HIV. So one of the reasons that they started this President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, was around the national security concerns about the impact of HIV and AIDS on destabilizing countries and regions and on transmission to different parts of the population. In some of the countries, AIDS had a devastating impact on the people who were very important, members of the bureaucracy, senior members of the army, teachers. So, the ability, and there were lots of AIDS orphans, and some of them unfortunately ended up in some of the rebel groups. So again, the impact of infectious diseases on society are sometimes difficult to predict, and the benefit of being able to identify them or at least be ready to take care of them is really critical. I mean, the difference in Korea was, the government, learning from MERS, had planning sessions, tabletop exercises. They would go through what would it take in order to track people and to test them. And so, when COVID-19 happened, they were ready. They had actually done a tabletop exercise on a respiratory virus viral illness coming from China in December. And then, of course, in January, they had COVID-19. So they were better prepared. Even countries that people considered well prepared, like the United States, were not ready. And this gets to the idea that every pandemic is different. Every infectious agent is capable of doing different things, and you need to be able to look at the data, make decisions based on those data, and change what you're doing. And the inability to do that contributes to delays in response, and those delays in response you've seen sometimes had really dramatic and devastating consequences.
So is it fair to say that most viruses come from animals? We had pigs, birds, bats, mouse. So what's going on here is like animals, they carry a lot of viruses.
So all species have viruses, and one of the odd things is some of these viruses don't make their host species sick. It's like bats. Like, why is it that bats have SARS and MERS and SARS-CoV-2? And bats are very unusual, and it may be that bats are more unusual than we think. And no one quite understands why, but they don't react to the virus the same way that we do. Their bodies manage to control it. It keeps the infection from killing them. And their body's immune response doesn't overreact. It does just enough to keep it under control. So the virus is still there. People speculate maybe it's related to, the amount of energy that they expend when they fly, because, bats are, one of the few mammals that truly can fly. But no one really understands why bats. But, there are other examples. The hepatitis E that I talked to you about, that has a 30% mortality in pregnant women, it doesn't harm the pig at all. SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, in the species that it comes from, doesn't make them sick. The monkeys and the virus exist peacefully. It's when it makes a jump into a different species that you start to see, and even different species of monkeys. So in the host monkey species, the virus is fine. But an SIV virus that jumps to a different monkey species can cause significant disease, even death in those monkeys. So again, it has something very peculiar to do with the way our immune system recognizes and attacks diseases. And what you want to avoid, and what unfortunately happens, at least in COVID-19, is there appears to be an overreaction. Certain parts of the immune system are doing too much. And that exuberance, I guess, of the immune system actually causes some damage.
So how is it that the scientists and experts were able to develop this mRNA vaccine this fast? I think that's part of the reason why people are skeptical. Like you see nurses like refusing to take vaccines. Like, what exactly is a mRNA vaccine, and is it like easier and cheaper to manufacture now?
Right. And we don't do a good job of communicating. We think, when we're scientists, we come up with the prize and we figure everyone's going to be happy. It's not like we've just started working on them. We've been working on RNA vaccines for at least 2 decades. So just taking a step back then to biology, you start with the genetic information, or DNA. DNA has to find a way to relay its message, all that information, in order to make the things that your body needs in order to function. So it creates an RNA message. So DNA goes to RNA. That RNA message makes its way outside the nucleus, which is where the DNA sits in a cell in your body, and it's translated into protein. And the proteins then, become muscles or other parts of the cell, or in the case of a virus, it becomes a part of the virus outer coat, or some of the proteins that the virus needs in order to replicate, to grow. A Nobel Prize winner said a virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein. And in a way, that's extraordinarily apt. The beauty of RNA is, as soon as you publish the sequence of a virus, so as soon as the COVID sequence was published, a person who's interested in an RNA vaccine could say, okay, this is the sequence we want. It codes the outer spike, the little club-like things, the spike proteins that are on the outside of the virus. You can say, well, this is the spike region. We'll just take it out, we'll turn it into RNA, and you can do that overnight or within a few days. So you can then take that RNA vaccine, the initial one, and test it in mice. And if you're lucky, then you'll see a response. It'll make the right infection-fighting proteins that you can measure, and you're off and running. And you can do that in a very short period of time. If you were doing a more traditional approach, say making a protein, you would take that genetic sequence, which everyone needs to have, and you'd put it in you do some genetic engineering of a plasmid. You'd insert that into a cell, then you have to grow it, and you have to wait.
Sounds more time consuming.
Well, yeah, and then then you have to take that protein that's now floating around in a flask, and you have to purify it. And when you purify it, you have to make sure that you don't do anything bad to it, because if you happen to change the way the protein folds on itself, it could change the vaccine. So there are all these steps in a traditional protein vaccine that are a cause for delay compared to an RNA vaccine. With the RNA vaccine, you get the RNA, you inject it into someone, and what you know is that the person's cells will automatically fold that RNA, so the protein that comes from the RNA, the right way. One of the other vaccines that got out really quickly is a whole inactivated virus vaccine. So 2 vaccines from China and 1 from India. What they did is as soon as you can isolate COVID-19 and grow it up in a culture, you can use that culture to infect other cells, and pretty soon you'll have lots of virus floating around in the cell culture. And you don't want to inject live virus, so you use formaldehyde or you use heat and you kill it, or a different chemical, and you kill it. And then you purify that killed virus, you mix it up with alum, which is an aluminum salt, and you inject it. And that's, we have lots of vaccines that are based on very simple, old-fashioned technology. A little less fast than RNA, but still very quick. I mean, the Sinopharm vaccine, 79% efficacy, was announced in December, so around the same time frame as the RNA vaccines.
That was my question too. When you say efficacy level, why do all these different brands of vaccines have different level of efficacy?
Yeah, and so that's a really important. So, for instance, Pfizer, 95%.
Right.
Moderna, 94.5%. Is there a big difference between 95% and 70%? 70% is a good vaccine. The US FDA said, and the WHO said, anything over 50% they would consider licensing. So, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it was tested under some very unusual circumstances. The mutant coronavirus was emerging in South Africa at the same time that they were testing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And it protected against that. In the United States, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was 85%. Of course, there wasn't a lot of the new variant circulating. But the important part was that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine protected against severe infection and hospitalization. And those are the things that you're really interested in. So they actually were able to provide a significant amount of information about severe disease.
Regular people like us, we panic when we hear, oh, it's only 55%, effective. It's like that doesn't sound very good compared to 98% efficacy, right?
And and all of these are amazing vaccines. And anyone that's approved by Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea or FDA in the United States or EMA, I would be happy to take and give to my family. The important thing is that we vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Again, continue to wear masks and all the other distancing and tracking, tracing, and treating. But we really need to control the explosive growth of infections. One of the good things and the bad things about this pandemic has been the amount of information that's available has been enormous. I mean, things are being published on the internet before they're actually fully reviewed in scientific journals. So sometimes there are going to be changes in some of the data that when you're reviewing a paper for a journal, you make recommendations to the authors that they may need to change this. They may need to rephrase the way they talk about
We're talking about peer review, basically.
Peer review, exactly, peer review. And that's, right now, you're putting peer review out onto the internet, and the first set of peers that you get are actually whoever wants to download it from the internet. And that's been remarkable for those of us who are working in the field, because we actually get to see the data.
I think it's a double-edged sword. It could be misinformation or it could be really fast.
That's the flip side, that unfortunately we aren't able to control the misinformation. And the misinformation is really rampant. And what do governments need to do? Well, governments need to make vaccines accessible. So you have to make it easy to get. You have to positively socialize it. You have to talk about the vaccine to the same extent that the naysayers are talking about the vaccine. And you have to talk and emphasize why it's so important. In some countries, in low and middle income countries, they have national vaccination days where, it's everyone goes out and the ministry's out in force and they're trying to vaccinate as many people as they can find. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we have enough vaccine to do that. Yeah. I mean, right now, there's just a terrible shortage of vaccine. And, countries all over the world are asking why they don't have more. I mean, you saw the European Union temporarily slapped a ban on exports of the AstraZeneca vaccine because their supply was being cut because of problems in the manufacturing. Low and middle income countries, by comparison, haven't gotten many doses at all.
Just exactly as you warned. Remember, we talked about this whole inequity problem.
Yeah, it's, we have this COVAX mechanism. We have this thing that was set up by World Health Organization, by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, to provide 2 billion vaccines by the end of 2021 to 189 countries around the world. The WHO feels now that they have adequate guarantees that they will have 2 billion doses. The problem is not having enough, but when. Vaccines are actually a fairly complicated biological product. This is something that's actually grown and has to be made. And at every step, if you fail quality, the whole batch could be discarded. And so, and you'd want that. I mean, these are biological products. They have to be safe and effective. They're given to healthy people. And so the standards are very high around vaccines, and you'd want them that way. When we say expedited, people think, oh, they're cutting corners. Well, in fact, the FDA completely redoes the statistics to make sure that the vaccine does what the company says that it does. AstraZeneca didn't submit its data to the US FDA. There's another trial that they're doing for Operation Warp Speed, which is a US program, that will be submitted. Again, this gets to the expectation of these, what we call stringent regulatory authorities, for the quality of the information that's provided and the level of safety and efficacy that they're going to demand.
What's the most important thing for us to be prepared then for the next pandemic? Surely we've learned something out of this whole thing. So what's that one thing we could be doing to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic?
So this is going to disappoint you, but it's not one thing. It's many things. So one thing is we need better surveillance. We need to be able to know where in the world these viruses are jumping. We also need to study the viruses that can jump or might jump in greater depth so that we know what to expect, which means also that we need to have the kinds of diagnostic platforms that will be able to identify very rapidly viruses that are making the leap into humans. Testing is another very important thing. Then open transmission of information. As soon as a country finds out about this, it can't say, well, this is ours because of intellectual property concerns. We're not going to share the sequence with anybody. For something like this, we have to make information available publicly as quickly as possible. So to the credit of the Chinese government and the Chinese researchers, by the first week in January, we had sequences, which were then used to develop the first set of vaccines. So one of the reasons we could do that was that we knew the genetic information. We had the sequences, which allowed us to generate vaccines. So that's one part. The second part is actually also, I would say, prophylactic, a preventative measure. And that is having organizations whose job it is to develop vaccines rapidly for outbreak diseases, emerging infectious diseases. And so for many countries in the world, that's CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. So CEPI had practiced. They used MERS as an example. They used Nipah virus, which probably most people haven't heard of, and the Lassa fever, which is a fever, an illness that is found in West Africa. Those were the initial ones. Now chikungunya has been added also, and a Rift Valley fever. But these platforms were very important because it allowed CEPI to experiment to understand what was working and what didn't work. It allowed them to have relationships with different companies so that when SARS-CoV-2 happened, before they actually made an announcement that they were taking applications, they could actually query companies very quickly to ask them if they'd be interested, because they already had relationships. They already had contracts in place with some of these companies. The next part is also preparation, and this gets to preparing for a pandemic. Does a country have the right means to control pandemics through testing, tracking, isolating, and treating, which they did in Korea very well, but also practicing it, having a tabletop exercise, going through the motions, finding out if, for instance, if you're in the United States, can the Center for Disease Control, which is a federal government agency, communicate rapidly and get good information from each of the 50 states? And it turns out the answer to that question was no, but we didn't really figure it out until this whole thing was in the United States and causing huge problems. So again, we have to be ready to act quickly, and it's always helped. This is an old Army person talking, if you practice. I think that the other part is, a uniform set of communication. I mean, the United States, you got conflicting messages, people were pointing fingers, no, it's not my job, or yes, it is a problem, no, it isn't a problem. Where in Korea, for instance, or in Australia, you got one consistent message, this is a problem, this is what we're gonna do. Everyone has to follow the rules, these are the rules. I mean, the United States had vaccine. They were woefully behind their own schedule in terms of being able to vaccinate. And every state was left to devise its own plan. There was no single national plan, right? So again, hopefully these are all going to be lessons that many countries will learn as they've rolled out vaccination.
I guess I'm just concerned about the scenario where, let's say, the whole country is vaccinated, but then they start allowing international travel again, and all these maybe people from the countries that haven't been vaccinated, they come over.
Yeah, I suspect the government is going to probably require either vaccination or quarantine. Right. Still. And that system has been relatively effective. How the vaccination certificates are going to roll out, or if vaccine passports are going to be necessary, really not clear. It seems that WHO may not be completely supportive of that idea on the one hand. On the other hand, there isn't going to be travel, because if a businessman is coming here for a 3-day trip and has to quarantine for 2 weeks, it's going to make it impossible. And now you have to quarantine when you get back to the United States. Evidence of vaccination will be very important. But what is going to be the standard? Is it going to be an electronic standard, or is it going to be the yellow WHO immunization card? And so, there has to be a system that we can verify. That countries can verify. And there has to be an international standard. And, hopefully as vaccines being rolled out, the people who can afford to travel will be able to get vaccinated.
This whole idea of vaccine passport, is that something that you just thought of, or is it something that already exists?
Oh, no, people have been talking about it. I think that organizations are looking into it. It gets to be a part of a actually bigger question in global health. Is it possible to make an electronic medical record? And the problems with electronic medical records more broadly are around privacy and security. But there have been a number of small companies, and maybe some larger ones as well, that have been thinking about what it would take for a set of governments to recognize a common standard for vaccination. So a country, and I'm making this up, the UK, is keeping track. How does the UK let Korea know that Joe Smith has been vaccinated?
Right.
And how does Korea verify that? And so all of these things still need to be worked out. But there are lots of companies, lots of smart people in these startups and things thinking about this exact question. And I just hope that the governments are doing the same.
If you had to take a guess as to when the next pandemic is coming.
Can we predict the next one? We can tell you what types of viruses might be likely, coronaviruses were an early target because we know they jump back and forth.
What about things like dengue fever?
And so these would be emerging or re-emerging diseases. So dengue is all over the world. The thing is about dengue, though, it doesn't actually kill many people. So, annual deaths from dengue are in the few thousands. The same would be true of and Zika, for instance, spread very, very rapidly in South America and then kind of stopped. And so again, we have some vaccines that we think might work against Zika, but we are unable to test them fully because at this point it's kind of difficult. Because you need, remember, in order to test a vaccine, you need to have enough evidence of infection in order to begin the testing. Dengue would be another potential candidate, and there's another virus called chikungunya, And actually, IVI is doing a study with chikungunya vaccine now in Colombia, Panama, and Thailand.
I've never heard of that. What is that?
So chikungunya is another virus disease, and it really causes severe aching in the joints. Again, chikungunya probably won't kill you. It's like dengue, right? You get sick. You feel awful. You feel like every joint in your body is aching. And in the past, we thought, well, it's probably more tropical disease. It doesn't. But we've seen spread of chikungunya now in South America. There are occasional cases in Europe, and there are cases now in the southern United States. And whether this is related to global warming or just the normal tracking of mosquitoes and mosquito vectors, these are diseases that are all potential. And for instance, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, actually has a chikungunya vaccine program. CEPI is, for instance, concerned about some viruses. There's one in West Africa called Lassa fever, but it involves a particular type of mouse species. And so it's probably less likely to spread outside of that region. But again, we can always be surprised. The thing is that, and we always forget, pandemic flu is something that does happen, a little bit longer than every decade or so. So I think flu, highly likely. Another major pathogen like an HIV, out of the blue, comes to shock us. Those occur much less frequently. And the good news is that in general, diseases don't escape from vaccines. Flu would be one example where there are new mutants being generated that require new vaccines to be made. But most of the other vaccines that we have been relatively stable, despite their prolonged use and very extensive use. Again, controlling pandemics with vaccination is easier than dealing with one without a vaccine. I think we've learned that with COVID-19.
We rely on you to be that ultimate communicator of science. We really hope that people listen to you and take you seriously and don't see you as that political figure. You're just doing your job.
Right.
We just hope that people get that.
No, thank you. And your questions are always really insightful, and they really get to the heart of the big questions that not only we have, but that people have. Are the vaccines safe? Do they actually protect? What's the difference between 95% and 50%? And when will we be able to be vaccinated? All of these are very critical questions. Let's just hope that the world will get together and will allow or provide funding for all the people on the planet to be vaccinated as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.